2 minutes. Do you want me to ring this bowl, or do you want me to... I'll start with my hands up and see if that works, if it doesn't. Elizabeth Gilbert once wrote, "Grief does not obey your plans or your wishes. Grief will do whatever it wants to you whenever it wants to. In that regard, grief has a lot in common with love." We come here today to celebrate the life of Erik Esselstyn, a beloved husband, father, brother, grandfather, uncle, dear friend to this community. We here are all recipients of his grace, as he loved everyone here, and he endeavored to make our world a more beautiful and perfect place through his contributions to eco-justice and the universal oneness of humankind. He loved us, and that's why we grieve, and we grieve to show our love. So let us celebrate Erik for who he was, a visionary, a polymath, and a philosopher. But mostly he was an unheralded hero for this planet that he loved so deeply and the people he loved so much. And for all of us who loved him in return, we can finally say goodbye. May his name and memory be a blessing for eternity. Amen. I invite you to close your eyes for a moment and imagine a thread circling its way down from heaven until it finds you here in this place. Feel this thread weaving its way among you, around you, between you, binding us to past and present in sacred love, love for God, love for all creation, love for yourself, and love for Erik. As you feel this love surrounding you, enter a moment of silence, a sacred silence. And in this space, bring a special memory or thought in honor of Erik. As you come out of this sacred silence and back into this space, I would like to share with you a greeting that we use for our morning service that Selena asked me to share with you today, because it speaks to Erik's sense of egalitarianism and our community. Greetings, my beloved. I greet you, my family, with the love of Christ. On behalf of our community, our ministers past and present, I'd like to welcome all of you, whether you are here in person or joining online, to the Old Meeting House. The Old Meeting House is an inclusive, welcoming community that has loved, cared, honored, and welcomed all who have entered this sacred space for over 200 years. We love you for how God made you. That is to say, we love you because of your race, ethnicity, ability, sexual and gender identity. We care about you, whether you are young or young at heart. We honor you, whether you are a visitor or if you've been a member for over 50 years. And we welcome all, whether you are Christian or if you're searching for truth in your own particular way. We hope that in the time we share together, that you feel yourself surrounded in God's loving embrace. We pray that you are open to receive this blessing, and we pray that God's blessing of unconditional love inspires you to become the person God created you to be. Amen.
While this Wendell Berry poem that I'm about to read is a favorite of mine, I can't help but think of Erik and how these words might have resonated with him. The peace of wild things. When despair for the world grows in me, and I wake in the night at the least sound in fear of what my life and my children's life may be, I go and lie down where the wood drake rests in his beauty on the water, and the great heron feeds. I come into the peace of wild things, who do not tax their lives with forethought of grief. I come into the presence of still water, and I feel above me the day-blind stars waiting for their light. For a time, I rest in the grace of the world and am free.
Please stand in body or in spirit as we sing a hymn in honor of Erik, Blue Boat Home. It is a familiar tune. It is found in your bulletin. All rise.
Good afternoon. I'm going to start with gratitude. I wanted to thank Ramin, all the folks who organized this event, all the other participants, my sister Jody, who's been doing all kinds of paperwork related to Dad's death. I wanted to thank her in public. I wanted to thank all of you for showing up, everybody tuning in from afar. I also want to express my gratitude for Erik, but I will come back to that later. First, an interactive moment. Raise your hand if you knew Dad before he moved to Vermont. Okay, maybe 10%, something like that. So there are many of you that I have not met, and I'm going to give a lightning quick backstory. I'm Erik's son. Dad married Mickey, my mom, in 1967, and they were married, had Jody and me, and Mom died in 1999. Dad moved to Vermont in 2001, and around the same time, I met the love of my life and moved south to be with her. And Dad, when I was younger, gave me advice about writing, and one of those pieces of advice was to imagine that you are taking the reader on a journey. So in putting together this, I'm thinking of taking you all as on a journey as your guide to Erik land in the 20th century. And I'll focus on the years before 2001. And Erik land is a beautiful and complex place. Maybe you can keep an eye out for these landmarks as we go, these images as landmarks. An unlikely open-faced sandwich, a plateau ending in a precipice, and a circle. Dad was far and away the most influential man in my life. Not just a father or a role model, but truly a hero. If you imagine me as an elementary school student, this was when we were in Maine. I went to a sort of Waldorf-y school, and we spent a lot of time studying myths like the Greek myths and the Norse myths. And my dad was, at that point, was probably around 200 pounds, a lot of muscles. I sort of thought he was like Thor or Hercules. He was an athlete. This was something that was not mentioned in his obituary. I did want to mention this. And he would tell us stories about his 3 undefeated seasons in high school. He played tough sports. He played football and lacrosse. He was a paratrooper. Oh, and by the way, the 3 undefeated teams, if you see Jody after the service, she can show you something related to one of those teams. He was a paratrooper, and these were things that fascinated young Blake. As you might imagine, he had a number of scars on his face, on his collarbone, on his knee, and great stories to go with these scars. But the most impressive scar was on his abdomen, and also the most impressive story. He sort of had 5 belly buttons. We used to joke about how he had 5 belly buttons. There were these dimples in his abdominal area. I don't know if folks know, but in 1976, he was diagnosed with a life-threatening cancer and had to go through a pretty radical surgery to overcome that. Many thought he would not, but he was still alive. And that beating cancer was something that made a strong impression. At some point, I learned what Yale represented and found out that Dad went to Yale and was in a secret society. Also, he knew how to operate a tractor and would take me for rides on the tractor. And I remember a story he told me from playing lacrosse in college. And for those who don't know, lacrosse is a contact sport where you're actually allowed to, in the men's game, hit your opponent with the stick. On their arms, mostly, that's what the rules call for. And in the 50s, the sticks were made of usually ash, pretty solid wood. And occasionally he would talk about an opponent that would try to play dirty and do things that were sort of below the belt while the ref wasn't looking. And Dad took pride in then out-hustling and outplaying that opponent and making them regret that and retaliating, inflicting pain on them in ways that were entirely within the rules, mind you, often going for the wrists. That was the vulnerable point. He was a rule follower, and he also knew all the rules of grammar, what was right and wrong. This was important to me as a youngster. So I had this action hero who was also scholarly and law-abiding, fighting for justice. Such a person might be a distant person or a taskmaster or overbearing, but not Dad. He was emotionally available, willing to be vulnerable, supportive when I stumbled or flailed, reassured me that it was okay for boys and men to cry. And this pairing of strength and sensitivity is the first of things about Dad I'm going to mention that might seem like contrasts or contradictions. I know we all have contrasts within us. We live in a country founded on contradictions. This kind of dichotomy is not new, but I think Dad had an unusual amount of what we might say are unexpected combinations that turn out to be complementary. There's a famous line I associate with Michael Jackson, "I'm a lover, not a fighter." Dad was a lover and a fighter, a tenacious tiger and a gentle soul. As an illustration, if you imagine raisin toast, toasted raisin bread, Dad would take that and then add mustard on top. Maybe even bread and butter pickles. It might not be a combination that appeals to everybody, but it worked for him and it worked for me. It worked well for me, his kinds of combinations. Other such combinations, he was an old-fashioned gentleman, teaching me that I should, if I went on a date, I should pull out the chair for my date before she sat down. But at the same time, he was an embracer of New Age, 70s, alternative lifestyle choices. I'll talk more about group therapy and holistic health stuff later, but you may be surprised that in the 70s, he used a pick comb and combed his hair into an afro. And he would say, if he was meeting somebody he hadn't met before at the train station or something, I'm 6'2" and I have an afro. That may be hard to imagine for the Dad that you know, but another combination, he was a farm boy. Grew up on a farm, and he truly identified as a farm boy. He loved to split wood and dig in the dirt, but he was also super educated. 3 degrees from Yale, a doctorate from Harvard. He was thrifty. He would wear shirts until they were threadbare and get them patched multiple times, but also generous to organizations and his alma mater and people in tough circumstances. He would wrestle with the most daunting of global problems and also focus incredible attention on how to hang the hook on the back of the basement door. He went to a prep school with the children of the elite and found himself in some exclusive circles. The secret society I mentioned is probably the most famous one at Yale. And so he had classmates in the country club set and people making 7 figures. But he sought opportunities to work and collaborate shoulder to shoulder with people who hadn't finished high school, let alone college. He was an intellectual who felt it was important to have well-developed pectoral and deltoid muscles. And speaking of combining the physical and the cerebral, in the obituary it spoke of his having served in the military as a paratrooper. I want to clarify for the record, he was also in military intelligence. And in case people are wondering, he did not see combat. This was between Korea and Vietnam. Enough of those for now. I found something in some papers of Mom's in some files in North Carolina, and it was an epitaph exercise. In the 1970s, both he and Mom were in some workshop or something where they were asked to write their own epitaph. And I'm afraid that I don't have the exact wording, but the gist of it stuck with me, and I'll do my best to paraphrase, that the epitaph he wrote for himself was, "He lived according to his choice and found contentment." And I suspect that this exercise was from the 70s, maybe the 80s, after this cancer as a pivotal point. He had been given about a 1% prognosis to survive. Well, depending on, maybe the story got amplified. Certainly in the low single digits, a prognosis to live beyond 5 years. And so if you were told you might have that few years to live, and you were not even 40 years old, what might you do? So I think Dad started really exercising his free will in a different way after that. And there's a video on the website that's linked to from the obituary that talks some about this period and some of his awarenesses after that cancer, which I recommend. He examined really some hard knocks and tragedy from his earlier years, what he would call emotional hammer blows. He had departed from a predetermined career path in his 20s, but did more reflection after the cancer. He was working for years on an autobiography that he tentatively titled Changing Stride. And I think this attention to free will manifested in a path through Erik land in the late 20th century that was winding and variable and somewhat unpredictable. He may have been a rule follower, but not a convention follower. In his career, he was an educator and then a counselor, working with people on relationships and their blind spots and their suffering. He was a writer. He had some brief forays into entrepreneurship, and he did environmental work. And when he shifted into environmental work and people asked him about that, he talked about how sometimes he found there was a common theme that the patients he worked with when he was a therapist were in denial about what was going on in their lives, and he found that society often was in denial about issues going on with the planet. In terms of his variable path, he, as an adult, lived in 9 different states, changed location quite a bit. And while his career and geography were variable, there were some things that were rock steady and predictable. Steadfast devotion to physical exercise. I've alluded to this a little bit before. He loved telling about how when a clinician who was new to him would ooh and ah over his vital signs and his blood work. He stayed committed to addressing difficult emotions and felt that that was strongly related to his ability to stay healthy. He followed what he believed to be a healthy eating regimen, and I want to give full credit to my mom and to Selena, who are the actual ones preparing almost all of the food that he ate. And he was consistent right up until the end with creative engagement, largely in writing, harnessing his brain and his heart to find ways to express and convey his thoughts in words, which I think was important for preserving his mental acuity. And how much writing he did for work varied, but his writing of letters and emails never abated. He liked to say, there is freedom in discipline. And that particular Erikism doesn't resonate so much for me, but it's the kind of thing he loved to say, and I think is indicative of him. He spoke often of his sort of, if you were to graph his quality of life, you have a y-axis here representing quality of life and an x-axis relating to time. He hoped that his life would continue over time with high quality of life and then end suddenly without a period with a decrease in quality of life. He wanted to stay independent, avoid relying on other people. He's talked sometimes about his dream of falling off a horse at age 93. And even that image is evocative of the swift, steep drop. And as it turned out, he was active until his final weeks. And his decline was much faster than expected. Some doctors as recently as 3 or 4 months ago, were saying that they thought he might live for 4 more years. I want to thank my stepsister, or as Ramin said, and I appreciate this term, my bonus sister, for alerting me to where I was far away about how fast he was in decline. And it enabled me to be here for some invaluable time with him at the end of his life. And I wonder if maybe his quick exit was in some way by choice. I'll talk more about choosing battles in a moment. And compared to the earlier variability, I think he was perhaps more rooted after moving to Vermont. I'm going to take a quick aside about hearing loss. I think it actually was a significant part of how he related to people. And in his final decades, hearing loss was significant for him. He had prided himself on being a good listener. As I mentioned, he had done group work and counseling with my mom. And it was very hard for him not to be able to hear well. So take heed, young folks in the audience. Don't abuse your hearing. After his hearing became more difficult for him, his side of the conversation could become longer as dialogue became harder for him. And speaking of going long, Dad could be known to ramble, but he did respect the limits when he was on a panel. I remember him talking about a panel, for example, where he was one of 3 speakers, and each speaker was supposed to speak for 10 minutes. Let's say it was a 45-minute session. Each speaker would speak for 10 minutes, and then there would be 15 minutes for question and answer. And it seemed like invariably other people on the panel would take more than their time, and Dad would be left, and 30 minutes had already gone by, and he would graciously cede his time so that there would be time for the audience to do question and answer. Dad, I hope you will understand if I'm going a bit longer than my suggested time. I feel like there's a lot I want and need to say. I would say that panel example gives you an idea of how he sometimes took the short end of the stick and did so with grace. And I point out that there were times he did get the short end of the stick, but I want to recognize the enormous privilege that he and I were born into, being white, male, able-bodied, coming into economically comfortable families. And sometimes, like on the panel, he would cede his spot. Other times, he would fight and make his opinion heard. My daughter recently interviewed him for a school project and asked him what he was most proud of. And after mentioning his family, he talked about 2 efforts, one in Charlotte, North Carolina in the 1970s, one in Maine in the 80s, where he fought to preserve land, in one case in a park, in the other case in a land trust. And these were both born primarily of his vision, and he had to work to oppose the forces of relentless development. One last dichotomy sandwich. I would say Dad was a glass half full kind of guy, very much, lover of life, but also had profound melancholy about the future of humanity and the planet. And his time in Vermont, I think, was a synthesis of some of his previous work roles, being an educator and a counselor and a writer, and working in the service of the environment. I know that people speaking after me will cover this ground better than I can, also talk about his relationships here. Finally, I want to come back to gratitude. In his final days, Dad talked repeatedly about being lucky, about how fortunate he was, how grateful he was. And Dad, we feel lucky to have had you in our lives, and how you modeled how to be a husband and a father. Thank you, Papa. I miss you a lot.
at school every year, it is clear that we will make progress here. Every textbook is a tool. Erik loved his school songs. How many men can waltz into a town hall 60th birthday bash for my mother 2 full hours late and sing and dance on command with my grandmother intrusively videotaping the entire to-do? Not many, but that is our Erik, with a K, not a C. And it is exactly how he won not just my mom's heart, but a family full of C's, an E, a T, and a JAX, all at RHT.
Yes, when E dubbed me with a single-letter name, I felt like I, too, had finally been tapped for an inner circle, accepted into an inner sacred club where we could communicate in code. We were the E's.
With E, it was all so familiar, like there was some connective tissue behind the scenes, weaving our families together. Well, it turns out Mickey had sent E up on this quest to find Mom, her friend, who could sing to her grandchildren, and Tom had asked his girls to learn to be better stewards of the earth. So, E, we know you are here with us. We see your twinkle, and we feel your mischief. Please note, if anyone asks you, if Erik, Tom, and Mickey are still with us, working their magic, the answer is a resounding yes. Trust it. Magic happens.
Wasting no time at all, a ring on the finger, bells on the toes, he will have music wherever he goes. And we had a much-needed grandpa. Adding years to our lives with vegetable-powered hugs and climate wisdom and insights for our growing family. What makes your heart sing? What is the art of living when you look climate in the face? Where's the nobility of the human experiment? Surely humanity will be okay. The web will never go silent. And how do you stay upbeat and have some fun? Remember the samba in your step.
Community is where it's at. Get to know your neighbors. It starts with trust. Empathy is the key. Learn to share. Keep it wet and green. Listen. 7 potlucks in Singing Bridge, sharing hopes and sharing dreads. A talking stick is passed. A windmill on the hill. A water pump in the yard. A cellar full of wood. Russ's root cellar, ready for another year. A community trust, community power, a community car bank, community gardens, all in the works. A bridge, a light to bring good cheer.
Remember C
And E, when it comes down to it, Homo sapiens are a cozy, cuddling, schnoozling species. So let us all take a moment and call Erik into our hearts and into this sanctuary, and with our very best polar bear growling embrace, give each other a big bear hug that he invented and some much needed vitamin H.
Do you want to do this? We're good. Should we just move? Yeah.
I'm supposed to talk about how Joe Vine is.
Oh, perfect. Okay, yeah. Just
I don't want to interrupt any hugging, but I did want to say, as Dad might say, that the role of Joe Vining tonight, and tonight's performance is being played by Alice Vining and Sandy Weiner. So they will be coming up. It's a slight departure from what you see in the program.
So I'm Alice Vining, and I'm going to speak in three voices, not biblically, though. I'm speaking really for Michael Mayer, my old friend, my husband Joe Vining's old friend. Mike couldn't be here, so he asked Joe to read something, and then Joe couldn't be here, and so here I am. And this is Michael. How to compress 70 years of friendship into a handful of words. No effort is sufficient, yet this effort will have to suffice. It goes back to 1951 at Deerfield. What? Oh dear. Can you hear me? Yeah, all right. Days filled with quality education, challenging athletics, and evolving relationships. 4 years spin by, and a diploma from an amazing head, Frank Boyden, was handed down along with a spot in Yale's class of 1959. And all three of them were in 59. Along the way, Michael writes, along the way were summer days, some spent at Willowbrook Farm in Claverack, New York, ministering to Aberdeen Angus cows intoxicated with fermented silage, and tossing hay bales of bird's foot trefoil grass onto the hay wagon. Wait a minute. Yale's 4 years were a mixed bag, rooming together and culminating in an intense year sharing one of Yale's senior societies. And Joe Vining was a roommate during part of that time, too, at Yale. My late shift to medical school took us in different directions while we each found life partners and started our respective families. Erik battled with career choices, culminating in his degree in education and worked with community college systems in the Carolinas. A wild battle with biliary cancer left him intestinally replumbed and challenged by decades of further challenges, keeping his digestive tract grumbling along, often demanding urgent attention to beat back invading bacteria. Then Mickey's loss was a terrible tragedy, which none of us could alleviate. Despite all that, he found lasting satisfaction in his bond with Selena Moore and his reform efforts in North Montpelier over his further decades. Always intense in his focus on the environment, he drew support from his commitment to the Donella Meadows Institute and hammered his typewriter to refashion our behavior toward our environment. We were lucky enough to enjoy the sound of his knuckles rapping on our den's windows, this is at Kendall, as an introduction to another brief discussion over lunch here at Kendall. I always love to welcome Selena as well. I was helpless in helping Erik with the inexorable pain of his last days. We were all helpless in the face of this final onslaught. It moved so swiftly. We all miss you, Erik. Thanks. Thank you. Thanks. very much.
Hello, everyone. Uh-oh. I didn't think this would happen this early. I feel honored to be here. Whew. One, two, three, four, five. And emotionally moved. So I'm here really to talk about Erik and climate change, and actually the origin of how this wonderful booklet came about. It's basically because of some Yaleys, and it started in Ann Arbor, our exchange of climate change emails and what's really happening in the world. Sorry, can you hear me now? Okay. Okay. This booklet, it started in Ann Arbor, the origin of the people, with I and two good friends talking about climate change. And then Erik clearly was an obvious member of it. I'd gotten to know him because we were at the same class at Yale, and I was an editor of our Yale alumni stuff. And Erik would put this amazing, eloquent, stunning kind of stuff about climate change. So he joined us, and then a couple of other people joined us. And so the result is this great booklet that one of our classmates, Don Watson, put together. And what I'd like to do is actually read something. One of our people was George Saint-Vincent. And this is what George wrote about Erik right here. Erik, our mentor, to accept the reality of what is going on, to open and face the loss and grief that it evokes, consciously open to the question, how then shall we live? How can we be in service to the world? Focusing locally, because that is where our power is, journeying into a way of being in local service. May Erik live on in the many lives he has touched. And then Ashby Semple, who was not in our class, but who's the, George was not, he was a good friend from Ann Arbor. And Ashby Semple is the daughter of another classmate, Bob Semple. And pardon me a minute, I'm just gonna. Okay. So here's what Ashby said. The first time I visited Selena and Erik, I helped make cider, ate a delicious lunch, and heard Erik's extraordinary account of his self-directed recovery from a fatal diagnosis. I left that visit with magic in my heart and 3 wild turkey feathers that we'd found on our walk to the beach. Knowing Erik was an outsized gift, I took solace from his wisdom and inspiration from the generous way he lived his life. And receiving one of his inimitable emails to the Ann Arbor Six was like opening a present on Christmas Day. So next, a few personal things, somewhat inspired by what Ashby said about her visit. So I remember in 2015, I came to Erik and Selena's with our 2 daughters, Nell and Eliza. And Nell, who's a Waldorf school, yep. She teaches music at the Waldorf school in Keene. She saw Schubert on the piano, so she ended up playing the piano while Selena sang the Schubert Lieder. It was such a, and I remember Erik being so pleased with that, utterly heartwarming. And then he sort of stays with me a bit. So he was also really supportive of our son, the middle, who was a dancer, and is our son Alec, who is off in remote Arkansas as a homesteader. And I think that Erik thought that that was just great, just way, way off in the hinterland. And he now has a partner, which is great for a year, so that's terrific. And Eliza was a dancer and then a flower farmer, which Erik really liked the idea of, lives in Northampton, and is about to have Sarah's and my first grandchild. Took a while for me and for them. But anyway, that's due in February 12th. So a final memory for now. Joe Vining and I visited Erik in hospice 4 days before he passed on, as it turned out. Selena and Blake were there. Joe and I saw Erik sitting upright in his chair, his back very straight. His smile was radiant. He had a luminous glow inside and about him. And this is a vivid memory that will persevere for Joe and me, and I'm sure for you for a long, long time. So I was going to talk about Erik's sense of what is going to happen later on in life, and we don't necessarily, when we die, when we pass on, we're not dust. But there's something individual that very, very likely continues on. And I get that strong sense of Erik. So this is just wonderful. So yeah, I have this sense of Erik here right now, of course. So Blake, you started off with gratitude and ended with gratitude. So synchronistically, maybe, right about the time that Erik died, I get a daily email from something, a site called Grateful Living. I don't know how many of you know it, but it's really terrific. And every day I get a wonderful posting about grateful living. So this is the one that they had right about the time that Erik died, maybe the same day. It's by Rachel Naomi Remen. Perhaps the secret of living well is not in having all the answers, but in pursuing unanswerable questions in good company. So, thank you.
"20 years ago, at a strong living exercise class at the Four Corners School, I heard Selena announce that she was marrying this fellow named Erik. Little did I realize I was getting married too, as was the whole community, to an indomitable, ever-ready community energizer bunny. We talked about politics, dowsing, and how his visualization practice helped him survive terminal cancer. In my mind, I was checking off all the areas of common interest, or as Erik might say, ka-chink, ka-chink. But there is more. He grew up on a 12th generation family farm, picked stone, milked cows, and knew what a PTO was, and the difference between a tedder and a rake. There was something about those bushy eyebrows, the twinkling eyes, and his gift for storytelling, which drew me in. A few years later, I enticed him to join our writers group, and we have some of them in the audience here today. While carpooling, I learned he had stabbing pains in his liver and some worrisome test results. But an even greater concern of his was the lack of understanding by Americans about global warming. This and many other topics were discussed over bowls of soup at cafes in Montpelier. We joked and cried, shared details of our health crises with each other, and met to work and critique our writing. In short, we became close friends. When I was at Dartmouth Hitchcock with my first cancer, he was there at my bedside, offering an apple, along with an eloquent speech about its benefits. When he returned from Beth Israel full of powerful antibiotics and for high fevers, I would douse him and send energy. Writer's block and other distractions inevitably slowed our writing, so I created the fictional Writer's Police to badger Erik into finishing his memoirs about living with cancer and growing up on a family farm. But his big heart got in the way. This is where the discipline wasn't quite there, Blake, I think. Whether it's taking food to somebody who is ill, supporting a political candidate by holding signs in the freezing cold on Long Route 2, or writing op-ed pieces, they never got finished. I employed multiple fake voices on the phone and set up a special Writer's Police email account to flood his inbox. This resulted in meeting at his place to write in separate rooms. When our time was up, we shared what we had written by the large fireplace and visited a bit over bowls of Selena's wonderful Hubbard squash soup. It wasn't procrastination exactly, or virtue signaling. One time when the imprisoned man he was counseling needed help to build a fence at his house, Erik showed up and built it. The wife assumed her husband had managed to get a handyman to do it, and Erik let her believe that. Just a year ago, when Erik was bent over and in pain, he offered to stack wood for Julie, one of the scribblers, so-called, in our writing group. Another member of our group noted Erik's kindness and concern when her partner was diagnosed with cancer. He visited their house several times to talk about his experience with meditation and visualization. Erik always put others before himself, and it showed up in his writing. Carefully crafted prose showed the emotion of those around him, while he maintained a safe distance in the third person from his own feelings. Part of the critique from the writers' group was to pull, or perhaps a better word would be drag, Erik into his own feelings. And what a deep reservoir that was. Together, we cried when his little brother, Ditch, was killed in a farm accident, followed a year later when Erik was 9 by the death of his mother after a thyroid operation, and later the joy of a beautiful family and finding resilience during and after the depths of grief. Erik had many other stories to tell: Christmases with Lou Gehrig's widow, plying South America's west coast on a Danish cargo ship, and waiting on a Fort Bragg runway with other paratroopers attached to a military intelligence unit of the 82nd Airborne to jump into Cuba during the Cuban Missile Crisis were just the tip of the iceberg. While Erik was the ultimate circuit preacher for a plant-based diet, he never stopped hammering at the dangers from climate change. Much of his writing from a decade ago seems prophetic now, warning about America's role in the explosion which would engulf Israel and Palestine, the disintegration of unions, and the danger of fascism. Almost exactly 11 years ago, he wrote a warning to the old meeting house community, warning of higher food and energy prices and how we'll, quote, need support groups to openly share our deepening fears, unquote. I last saw Erik at the hospital a couple of days before he died. I was surprised at how he sat up in bed and took my hand despite his deep pain and exhaustion. He emphasized again how we must take care of each other in small communities, suggesting that we should get together with a few others to break bread. Perhaps next week, he said, once I've gotten out of this hospital room. He had, in the last couple of years, realized that there'd be no transition from fossil fuels, but the toughest transition he thought necessary for each of us was, as he wrote, quote, the recognition of the humanity of every other human on earth.
As you're hoping that's not an outline. As the last person on the panel, I am honored to be on the panel at all. I recognize my opportunity to provide something of a summary and also to make it personal. Who is Erik? And I use the present tense deliberately. Who or what are any of us? If someone asks me that personal question, who are you? I tend to identify myself in terms of vocation. I'm a retired teacher. Or I might situate myself in my family. I'm a married grandfather. But you see how limiting that is. It focuses entirely on my current state. It's like tearing a page out of a novel and saying, here, this is what this book is about. As an alternative, I encourage you to think of yourself, and especially Erik, as a story. I've only known Erik during the last couple of chapters. You've heard from some who've known him for the bulk of the book. And a few of you may have only skimmed the table of contents. But we can be sure that Erik's story is far bigger and more complex than we can convey or absorb today. And looking at our own lives that way, we can be generous with ourselves, knowing that at any one point of weakness or struggle, that's not who we are. There's a complex context, and the plot may yet twist toward redemption. Now, the metaphor might suggest that Erik's story is finished. The end printed on the last page, all of it bound neatly and ready to place on a shelf. But I'm not willing to say that. For all I know, Erik's story here may be only volume 1 in a series. In any case, an indelible part of each of us is a longing for transcendence, whether it is to experience something larger or something longer than this confined life. For Erik, this did not mean aspirations for a park-like heaven where he would reunite with departed loved ones. Rather, he wanted to extend his life through his family and friends, encouraging us toward goodness and healthy living. And he has already done that, and he's done that again this afternoon. Our missing him right now, these reminders of his passion for a better world, our longing to tell him just one more time how much he means to us, all lift Erik from the pages of his story and weave him into ours, so that his story has not ended with his earthly passing, and it won't end with ours either. The connections between all of our stories make each of them larger and longer than we are alone. A story, of course, is an arrangement of words. And have you known anyone more enraptured but not captured by words than Erik? Not for Erik, these shorthand emojis, one-line texts, or dashed-off emails. An editor's worst nightmare. Erik would find 20 additional words for any 10-word sentence. And we are all richer for his lavish loquacity. In my saved email file is a lovely thank you note from Erik for a 2017 sermon. His message is 547 words long. Much of it reads like poetry, including this comment on memories. In my mind, Erik writes, I have 1,000 vivid pictures of my past. I'll take them forward. I wonder where forward ends. I wonder where forward ends. Erik and I met in words and stories. He liked mine. I liked his. The epithet, a man of few words, doesn't apply to us. Nor does the phrase small talk. Erik always wanted to talk about his passions, the things that matter most. And as he approached his last chapters, his driving interest was not his own past or present, but the future, the next generation. In our last long conversation, Erik enthused about the Netherlands, not as a tourist destination, but as a societal model that we might yet learn from. We took several long walks some years ago, and I learned what a mountain goat Erik still was in his mid-70s. And I believe these treks brought out Erik's best self. In more recent years, we only walked out to retilt his solar panels twice per year. For Erik, this was not merely a household chore, but an invitation to a meaningful exchange. From the house to the panels is about 100 yards, but that means 25 minutes and 2 or 3 stories by Erik. I learned from our peripatetic peregrinations that when I suddenly found myself a stride or two ahead, it wasn't because of my longer legs, but because Erik was stopping to begin or resume the narrative. On the day of his death, I wrote this little poem, Walking with Erik. When we walked, you would pause to impart the next bit of a story, which was worth the wait, and a lesson in how not to hurry the right words. For they would come soon enough, sure as the path winding home. But now the pause is so long, and the walk, well, my friend, it will have to wait. I wonder where forward ends, Erik asked. I don't know, but it doesn't end with ashes, and it doesn't end here. Erik, the story, continues as we enfold him and ourselves in words of memory, the more the better, and as we incorporate his story into our own. Erik, the story, continues as long as our love for him lasts, as long as his goodness and passion embolden us, and through us, those whose tales are yet to be told. Erik, the story, continues and grows as large as the hopes and imaginings that transcend us. Where does forward end? In love, dear Erik, forward does not end at all.
others' journeys, known the sorrows and the fears, filled our buckets with a love so deep and strong. I'm so glad I've come to know you. There's so much I'd like to share with you, but now it's time for me to move along. So take a little of me with you when you go, and I'll take with me a little bit of you. And then when I'm feeling lonely, I will let your love enfold me, and I'll be right there to do the same for you.
This is a church, after all, so those of you who may not be believers will forgive me when I ask God's help for what I have to do. This is going to be very difficult. Selena, my dear and beloved Selena, you asked me to give a benediction. Well, you haven't come to your senses in the intervening 2 weeks, so here I am. We've had an awful lot of words today, as we would say in the Maritimes, a whack of words, and a lot of poetry. Benediction implies, Susie and I were talking about this, something almost liturgical and priestly. Well, the Almighty has a powerful and incomprehensible sense of humor, and so I am not in the priesthood, which is probably a great relief to the church and to the souls on the other shore, and to my anarchist buddies, some of whom are in this room right now. So I will retreat from de facto priesthood and put myself in the rank of the poets, and we've had some fine ones in this room today. And the 29 little lines of verse, the first cluster of words addresses a couple of things that Tom mentioned and came up in one of the reminiscences. This is the question that we all ask at moments of great consequence, moments of life and death and life again, and growth and loss. And these come from a longer song poem by my good friend, the Zen rock and roll artist Tom Bishop. Last night I had the strangest dream. I dreamed I could all see it clear. I could name the stars. I could read God's mind. I knew what we're all doing here. Though I just couldn't wait to tell the whole world, I was wrapped inside that dream until dawn. And when I awoke, it went like smoke. Who knows where it goes when it's gone? Who knows where it goes when it's gone? You know, another benediction, Selena, would be probably the simplest thing. What Erik and I would take turns saying to each other when I'd bring him home from the men's group meeting. He'd say, "That was great, let's do it again." That's a that's a good benediction for many things we do. And I will hear that for years and years. This is a sonnet by the English writer who published pseudonymously as Hyacinth Hill. It's called The Green Children. And by the way, at the conclusion of this, there is a postlude. You'll see that in your flight plan. Ramin asked me to ask you to stand, so we'll do that. The Green Children. Music makers and painters and poets need no burial places. They never leave any bones. They do not, like farmers, turn to seed, like warriors fade, nor melt like ice cream cones. Before their deeds are done, their flesh is gone, tears in the ink and blood mixed in the paint. There is nothing left for grave or funeral urn but what couldn't be blown through a horn or beat on a drum, what couldn't be laid on canvas or formed into song. They leave no bones, and underneath the skin, you will find a brush, a baton, or a pen. Old elephants sink in secret ivory, hold away from men. Only the green children leave no bones, die many times, never grow old. Thank you for sharing Erik with us. Thank God for sharing Erik with us. God keep you, Erik. God keep all of us. Amen.